Irish history was changed when the leaders of the 1916 Rising were sentenced to death. But what if the executions never happened? Trial of the Century imagines the trial that Patrick Pearse was denied in life.
Patrick Pearse, by his own admission, led an armed rebellion against His Majesty's government.
You have to ask yourself what counts as a win.
Nothing less than Irish freedom.
You cannot build a free nation on the basis of slavery.
Postponing of Home Rule was strictly temporary. Not one solitary soul needed to die.
Now the time has come to answer one of the most divisive questions in Irish history.
What we did was not only right, but necessary and justified by history.
Was the 1916 Rising legitimate?
If you haven't swayed the public, they'll hang you, regardless.
And was Pearse, as the personification of the rebellion, guilty or not guilty?
This trial isn't just about the battle, it is the battle.
The task of passing a verdict now falls to a jury of 12, drawn from different walks of contemporary Irish life.
I'll certainly come to the jury table with an open mind, but I'll come to the jury table as the person that I am.
My great-grandaunt, Jenny Shanahan, who fought with James Connolly, she had lost 5 of her brothers and sisters, in the tenements, just dying out of poverty, so I'm not biased.
Well, I guess you want to have dissent. I'll be curious to hear the arguments against it. I'm aware of them. I don't find them particularly convincing.
I'm looking forward to being on a jury because I like arguing with people. So it's kind of a good habitat for me, I think.
It's the only time I'll ever be allowed on a jury, so, with my previous criminal history, so I'm going to make the most of it. I could go one way or the other at the moment.
All the main points of disagreement in the last couple of decades are here in this programme. It is a great opportunity for us to tease them out again.
Each member of the jury will bring their own unique background and experience to the table. They must draw on the historical record of the time, but also the benefit of 100 years of hindsight. Acting as chair of the jury is Pat Kenny.
Well, you're all very welcome, and I want to thank you all for agreeing to serve on the jury for this trial of the century. Now, your duty is, as jury members, to listen to all the evidence that's presented before you, take an objective view of it. I want you to also keep an open mind as to the views and arguments of your fellow jurors. At the end of this, we're going to ask you each to cast a vote by secret ballot. And the questions we want answered are, one, was the 1916 Rising actually justified? And was Patrick Pearse, as the personification of the 1916 Rising, guilty or not guilty? Patrick Egan, you're the resident historian on our jury today. What we are doing is imagining that Patrick Pearse had a prosecution by the British, a defence for himself, and also reviewing the evidence in a trial that actually never happened. What's the value in doing something like this?
Well, I think it's an imaginative exercise. I think it's an interesting way of approaching 1916, so we can maybe look at it from a different perspective.
Well, I think we should start at the very beginning, and I'm going to replay for you the opening statement of the defence as presented by Patrick Pearse in the trial of the century.
I ask you here today to consider Britain's future if Germany were to win this great war. Perhaps you can imagine unrest in this future, a revolt against the German occupation. Naturally, Germany speaks of violent radicals who endanger our future. Children are taught to denounce these agitators as traitors. Then, when they come of age, they can be sent to foreign lands to defend Germany's honor and interests on the battlefield. If you can imagine this future, you have already imagined Ireland's past. In that future, who would dare say to an Englishman he has no right to resist foreign rule, and yet they say it to us here today?
Now, Patrick, what actually happened?
So we're imagining what might have happened, but what actually happened was that General Maxwell decided to use field general court-martials to try them. And it wasn't just the main leaders. 171 were tried, 90 were found guilty and sentenced to death, and 15 of those had the sentence of death executed. But some of the court-martials were as short as 15 minutes long. They weren't able to call defense lawyers. They were held in private, even though that was going against the rules for these field general court-martials. And essentially what you were having was a procedure that was designed to try deserters on the Western Front being used to try these leaders.
Looking back, even to the minutiae of the law in 1916, I mean, were those trials legal at all?
The British privately acknowledged that they were of very dubious legality. They suppressed the records of these court-martials for over 80 years because the British admitted themselves that some people had been convicted on very thin evidence.
Well, I think we should maybe have a look at the case that might have been presented by the prosecution if there were to have been a trial like that. So this is the opening statement for the prosecution.
Gentlemen, this is an important case. Not simply because of the scale of death and destruction that lies in its wake, but because the very integrity and future of our society depends upon it. You must ask yourself this pertinent question. If we allow a radical minority to style themselves as revolutionaries on behalf of a majority who value peace, democracy, and the safety of their families, if we allow them to take the law into their own hands in our name, what sort of message will this send? What sort of future do we create? There is a better way.
And that's one of the questions we'll be looking at. Was there a better way than insurrection in the GPO? But I'm going to start with a different question for everybody around this table of jurors. And that is, if you were back in 1916 and you heard about the rising on Easter Monday, would you have gone in? Oisin, would you have gone in?
Well, I think, I probably have a different perspective considering where I grew up. I lived through the Troubles in the 80s and the 90s, so absolutely. Now, when I think about it, I'd be in there. I'd be stuck in the middle of it because the legacy that it has left for the Republic of Ireland is completely different to the legacy that is left for the 6 counties.
All right, Colin, would you go in?
I honestly don't know. And I think it's impossible to say whether or not I would. It'd be easy to say I would, but I don't know if I'd believe myself. I don't know if I have the courage. I can't imagine a situation in which I would be prepared to take a human life. I can't imagine a situation like that. So for me, that would have been perhaps the biggest barrier.
Eleanor, can you imagine a situation where you could take a human life?
No, I'm a coward in that way, but I am grateful for people who embody ideals and are kind of willing to put themselves at risk for that, so I kind of would...
So you wouldn't have gone in, but you would have admired those who did?
Yeah.
Damien?
And I would have looked at the British Empire and saw how many countries they went into. So I wouldn't mind going into a post office yet in my country.
Una?
I don't know, I'd like to think bravado would have driven me in there. But maybe I would have just been writing about it. Maybe I would have been reporting on it. I find it very difficult to kill someone. On the other hand, as a Republican, viscerally, I would kind of feel like I would be driven to do it, but the pacifist in me maybe would hold back. I think it's a very complex question.
Lynn?
Given me current situation, I would, and that's a privileged situation. If I go back in terms of me as a lone parent from a working class area, I don't think I would have had access to the rebellion, and then it would have been, what was it offering to me? So was it only offering freedom in terms of home rule, or was it actually going to improve the poverty, the overcrowding in tenements? And so I think I would have to look at it from that perspective.
But if you were, in 1916, a lone parent,
No, I wouldn't have had
You wouldn't
access.
have gone in. No, but you wouldn't have gone in and left your child behind, would you?
Well, I might have brought them with me. But no, exactly. Well, given that there was 10 to 20 people in the house, I'm sure there was plenty of people to mind the children. But yeah, I think it wouldn't have meant as much to me because when you're dealing with them kind of struggles, probably unity of Ireland and that kind of freedom is probably a little bit out of your grasp or out of your sight.
It would have been about the conditions in which you live more than about some ideal of freedom.
Me and the children would probably be looting, yeah.
Difficult for me, obviously being English, but would I have been brave enough? Probably not. Would I have been passionate enough about it? I probably wouldn't have been. Was there a threat to my family? Then I may have been driven to raise arms, but you know, I'd struggle to raise arms in any situation.
All right. Justine?
Like Lynn, I think it would have depended on the social circumstances that I lived in. If I was part of that intellectual set, that, you know, the literary revival, mixing with those people, I think I would have been very influenced by them. If I was living in the tenements, I imagine that I would have felt very bowed down and resigned to my poverty.
All right. Michael?
I would have been actively campaigning against it. And I would also have been actively campaigning against the Ulster Volunteers and the threat of violence against Home Rule that they engendered. And I would have been campaigning against the way the British Army ended the Rising. I think everybody was acting wrongly, and just because other people are acting immorally doesn't justify killing innocent people.
So you're, of the jurors around this table, you're emphatic. You would not have been in there, not alone that, you would have been raising your voice loud in opposition to what they were doing.
And for peaceful democratic politics.
Emma?
When I look at the unmitigated destruction wrought by the British Empire and colonialism throughout the globe, I think, I can't say 100%, but I think it's highly likely that I would have been there. I think any direct action I could have taken to strike a blow right at the heart of empire. So I would imagine I would have been in there, yeah.
All right, well, we're involved in the trial of the century with this jurors of men and women. Interestingly, there would not have been women on a jury in 1916. But we are going to look in some detail at the prosecution evidence after we take a short break. You're all very welcome back to the jury table, and we're going to continue with this imagined trial and the evidence that the prosecution might have brought into the courtroom. We imagine, for example, that they might have brought in Owen MacNeill. Now, if you remember, he was the man who countermanded the order for the insurrection. It was to be Easter Sunday, and he called it off. And this is some of his testimony.
Well, yes, in his school, St. Enda's, he fills the boys' heads with those legends of Cuchulainn, Fionn McCool, good versus evil.
Indeed. He said he would preach to those boys the antique faith that fighting is the only noble thing, and that he only is at peace with God who is at war with the powers of evil. Do you recognize those words?
I do. They're from his essay on education.
And what about this passage in support of war? The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Such august homage was never before offered to God as this, the homage of millions of lives given gladly for love of country. Do you recognize these words?
I do. I can't say I agree with them.
Would you agree that his ideas on education involved the poisoning of young minds?
Sir, if you think it is such a sin to teach the glories of death in battle, may I suggest that you stop paying your taxes? After all, they merely fund the British Army, who've sent more than a few boys to their deaths with notions in their heads. There's your poison, sir.
Damien, this idea, it's a glorious thing to spill your blood for your country. Is that an idea that appeals to you, that has justification?
It's a horrible thing to have to do, you know. But all the war correspondents in England at the time are saying the same thing about the glorious war, you know, that 20,000 people died in the Somme, and one fella said it was a glorious thing, their blood's sodden on the earth in France, you know. It was a great day for England and France and all, so that was the kind of the talk at the time, you know.
So the idea that was actually more current than we might imagine today in 1916.
I think it was, absolutely.
Spilling your blood for a particular political or nationalistic aim.
Yeah,
not unusual.
That was the kind of propaganda in England for the soldiers going over to fight, you know.
I think the fact that other people are doing things, the British Army were wrong and the Ulster Volunteers were wrong, that's irrelevant. These people had their own agency, their own moral agency, and they should be judged on their own behaviour.
If I say there are people who are prepared to die for their country, which is not yet real, who are prepared to die for their religion, you think Patrick Pearse, you also think ISIS?
Exactly. Well, I think if you take some of the writings of Patrick Pearse and if you replace the word God with the word Allah, you know, you're not a million miles away from the same type of justifications. Patrick Pearse was delusional. He was writing from the GPO as if he was leading the Republic. So either he was delusional or else he was putting other people, more naive people, into harm's way on the basis of something he didn't believe.
I think it's quite important, though, to make the distinction between being willing to die for your nation or for religion or alternatively for freedom. Like, I think being willing to die for freedom is quite different to being willing to die for your religion. So this is a colonised and oppressed people willing to die for their freedom and liberation, which I think is different.
First of all, I don't think there's any comparison between 1916 and ISIS. So there's no element of a dogma within nationalism of the time that sought to exterminate people on the basis that they were people of different faith, of different sexualities, of different genders. There's no element of that. So I think those comparisons is I think, just wrong.
Equating, you know, modern extremists such as ISIS with what happened in 1916, I think is just profoundly offensive and a bizarre kind of comparison, because also when you look at what they're actually saying and what their rhetoric actually was, it was founded on an egalitarian type of, you know, abstract or reality, whatever you want to call it, and it wasn't about oppressing other people or killing other people.
Well, what they did, again, if people want to die for their country, that's up to them. What these people did was killed other people for their version of a country that they demanded allegiance to.
I think it is unfair and inaccurate to say that Pearse's motives were abstract. He was fighting for self-determination for his country as he saw it, which is an international principle enshrined in international law now as a result of the Second World War.
But the country didn't exist at the time. The country was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland.
The leaders of 1916 didn't invent Ireland. You know, it did exist once upon a time.
We have to remember that 450 people were killed, and among the victims was the young child of a woman called Catherine Foster, and this is how her testimony might have appeared in the courtroom.
It didn't even seem like getting hit the pram. It was like a small rip just opened in it. I was inside before I knew what happened. There was a priest there. I tried to say it, but I just screamed. I couldn't get any words out.
What did you want to say?
They've shot my baby.
Sean Francis Foster, 2 years old, shot in the head in his pram.
So, Emma, that's the reality.
Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely heartbreaking, but I know who I blame for it. Because, again, a reaction against a violent and oppressive regime that is violent. If violence is the only logic that's understood, if it's the only way that you can eventually create a more peaceful nation or a more peaceful environment, then I understand what happened. So that story is absolutely heartbreaking, but I don't know, I feel it's like...
And also you have to decide who you're going to make responsible for that. I mean, first of all, we don't know who fired the bullet that killed that baby. It's horrific that that happened. The number of civilians who were killed during the rising, it's horrific what was visited upon the civilian population of Dublin. But who do we hold responsible for that? It has not been determined, and certainly I haven't seen anything that determines that Pearse and those who instigated the rising were responsible for individual civilian deaths to a significant degree.
You know, when you look at Bloody Sunday, it does have, you know, a lot of similarities with the child who was killed, and whether that was gunfire from rebels or whether that was gunfire from the British.
It did, but one of the first killings was on outside the Shelbourne Hotel, where a man who was delivering goods and some guys from behind the gates of Stephen's Green shot him in the head. Now, that man is already a widow. There were 6 orphan children because of that. And the person that you blame for that, 100%, is the individual who took the decision to shoot it. Absolutely. And I think that other incident, the one we just saw, it's more likely that the British Army shot that child. And so whoever shot that child is responsible for that.
But isn't it a case that if there hadn't been an insurrection, none of these people would have died?
Exactly. These people, they knew when they were going out that people were going to die.
That doesn't work, though. I mean, that's like saying if there hadn't have been an invasion of Ireland hundreds of years earlier, there never would have been an insurrection. We have to hold people responsible for their individual actions in the context in which they undertook those actions in the first instance.
But they
it's
did
the context
undertake.
of human rights abuses as well, I think. At what point do you say that that's okay, or is that ever
At any given point, it's now. If somebody now breaches somebody's human rights, that's wrong. You know, and I can't see anything beyond immediate self-defence to justify
the
that.
evidence by the city coroner in the trial was that many of those children were targeted, that there was evidence that they were shot in the head. So to be attributing blame to one side or the other based on individual cases seems to be a bit of a fool's game to me.
Some sort of historical perspective. I mean, my idea of the First World War is that it was a war of set pieces, the trench warfare, and it was armies versus armies. Here we have an insurrection within a city where inevitably civilians are going to die.
I think in 1916, they wouldn't have cared so much about civilian casualties or children being killed. They would have cared about the destruction of property, allying yourself with Germany, traitors to the empire, and I don't think they would have cared so much whether 40 children were killed or 400. For them, it was about the betrayal of the empire.
Now, we are in a position...
But for us today, I think it's an interesting thing.
We're in a position where we can look back and we have a fair idea of the analysis of history. But if you think at the time, you had people like Bulmer Hobson, an intrinsic member of the IRB, and he's kidnapped by the rebels and kept under wraps until the insurrection takes place. And this is some of the testimony he might have given.
Tell me, how well did you know the accused?
Him? He's the kind of sentimental egotist I find hard to tolerate. For one thing, the entire enterprise goes against the IRB's constitution. After the failure of the Fenian Rising in '67, the IRB inserted a clause which requires the decision of the Irish nation as expressed by the majority of the Irish people before any sort of action was taken against Britain. As far as I'm concerned, the IRB weren't responsible for this, nor were the Irish Volunteers. It was a junta, a breakaway group within both organisations.
So, even the organisation to which they belonged did not sanction the rise in the IRB, and you had a cabal within a cabal. Oisín, this notion that a few people can do this without the say-so of the people with whom they profess brotherhood.
Whenever we look at, what's happened within the Republican movement, there is those breakaway groups, those renegades, if you like. I still think it's slightly different, though.
But do you think, for example, that what Pearse and his colleagues did in 1916 gave legitimacy to a minority in Northern Ireland who ended up as the Provisional IRA, who committed all sorts of crimes and atrocities in the name of the entire nationalist population of maybe the whole island?
Nobody from any walk of life could stand over what happened in Enniskillen or what happened in Omagh. I think, there are atrocities that nobody could be proud of. I imagine even the people who carried those atrocities out, they couldn't be proud of what went on.
Both the Provisional IRA and the current dissidents and the Easter Rising rebels were all minorities within a minority of the nationalist community. They were entirely ignoring that portion of the Irish people that are unionist, and they were entirely ignoring the majority of the nationalist population that wanted to overthrow.
Yeah, but just because someone's a minority doesn't mean they're wrong. And just because a group is a minority of a minority doesn't mean they're wrong.
If we talk about minorities within minorities, I mean, perhaps actually we've cause to be grateful for the fact that within revolutionary movements, leadership in those movements can move the movements in a direction that the movement might not want to move in. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the peace process is one example in Northern Ireland of that, for instance.
And I think that the Pearse and Connolly, they thought what they'd done might wake up the Irish people, and it did. because the War of Independence happened, you know.
So, Nick, why were the English so awful to us over the years? Can you give us
Don't take it personal, it's the whole world.
Obviously, I hold a British passport. My wife and children have Irish passports. I worked in Hong Kong, and I've seen firsthand how, you know, certain people within that environment are still, you know, very colonial. People are not necessarily oppressed, but they're spoken down to, and they're not treated as human beings in the modern sense. And it's absolutely appalling and disgusting. And, you know, the English did oppress a lot of nations, and it's not something to be proud of.
Patrick, was the violence of the put-down, the destruction of Dublin and the executions, was this so as not to encourage any others who might have taken advantage of Britain's difficulty at the time? In other words, we've got to be emphatic here, or heaven knows where trouble will break out.
I'm not even sure if it's that or if it's just a military mindset seeing this as an extension of the First World War. You had British troops arriving in Dublin who were astonished to find that the people were speaking such good English because they thought they were meant to be going to France. And they were coming here because this was all part of the war. So I think it was this idea of a part of the empire stabbing the home country in the back by having this insurrection.
And I think there's a horrible dichotomy developing in what you're discussing, in that Irish people were encouraged and even paid to put their lives at risk for the English army in the 1914 war. But if they felt passionately enough about Ireland and the cause of the Irish, they were being tried and prosecuted and killed for that. And you know, it can't be right on one hand and wrong on the other.
The jury room's getting a bit warm, so I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take a short break, and then we'll have a look at the case for the defence in the trial of the century. Welcome back to the jury room, and we're going to focus now on the case for the defence. And the first witness we're going to hear from is Joseph Plunkett, because he was one of the military architects of the Rising.
Mr. Plunkett, could you elaborate on the status of the garrisons on the day of surrender?
Boland's Bakery, Marybone Lane, South Dublin Union. They were all well armed, well provisioned, and resisting right to the end.
So why surrender?
The British were shelling indiscriminately, and the city was burning. In front of us on Moore Street, 3 civilians lay dead, caught in the crossfire. I can remember one man. A bullet had snapped his neck, I think. His head was tilted to one side. His eyes were open, staring. It's not what we were fighting for.
So the surrender was to prevent further bloodshed and the death of innocent citizens. Now, Una, do you think that's credible?
Obviously, there was, you know, they set out knowing that they weren't going to win. But I would imagine when all of the shelling started and it was pretty clear that the city was going to be completely destroyed, that they didn't have a choice. You know, are you going to see the capital and beyond flattened utterly, or are you going to try and save some kind of face and see what happens in the aftermath?
I'm not sure. You know, Una said that they set out knowing that they weren't going to win. I'm not necessarily sure that you undertake any path with that. You have to believe you're going to win or you're going to achieve something.
Well, they clearly thought they were going to achieve something. I mean, you know, one narrative is that they would achieve martyrdom on these. But I think there is evidence to suggest that they didn't expect the British to unleash that level of bombardment against the civilian population. So, you know, the indiscriminate shelling of a civilian population these days would constitute a war crime.
Patrick, that idea that Joseph Plunkett adverts to in this fictional trial, that some of the garrisons could have held out, is that realistic at all?
Possibly some could have, because they weren't coming under fire. Some were ignored while they focused on the main areas and sealed them off. I think that some of the rebel leaders, like Tom Clark, wanted to fight to the death. And of course, if they had fought on to the death, we would have lost the next generation of leaders. We would have lost Michael Collins, De Valera, W.T. Cosgrave. You know, so many of them would have been martyred as well. And I think a decision was taken that they would probably take it to the next stage. And I think for Pearse, it was expecting death soon after.
There's another element to this. I mean, this was a coalition of voices in the GPO, and James Connolly probably had very different ambitions. I don't know, did James Connolly want to die? Did he want the blood sacrifice?
I don't know whether he was looking to die, but I believe in his fight more than I believe in any of the other fight in terms of equality, maybe because it's most relatable to me, but he's definitely the one that I would lean to more than any of the rest of them. I think it's hard to say. I think if you're going to go into battle, you're willing to die. Whether you want to or willing to is probably, you know, two completely different things.
It's much easier to be in favour of Connolly than it is to be in favour of Pearse. And I think there's a sort of a good cop, bad cop narrative has developed around Pearse and Connolly, almost like Collins and Dev. What Connolly was aspiring to were very tangible things, you know, that people could easily relate to. Pearse was much more intangible, intellectual. These were, you know, principles of freedom, self-determination. And that's why I think that this character assassination by innuendo has proved very successful in Pearse's case.
Connolly wanted to radically reorganise society so that the society that would have unfolded under him would have been a far more kind of equitable, fair and just society.
I think when you look at the Connolly-Pearse divide, and Michael Collins himself said afterwards that he was very much on the Connolly side. Connolly was the one he hugely admired. But I think Pearse has maybe suffered over the past 100 years. He's seen as maybe a bit of an oddball, a bit of a weirdo. We can't really understand why people would follow him in the GPO, whereas we know from the accounts of the survivors that they absolutely worshipped him, that he had this incredible charisma. We almost need to go back into the GPO to find out for
Patrick posed the
ourselves.
question earlier, what would have happened if the executions had continued and what would that have meant for the next generation? Say Collins and Dev had been executed. I don't want to be irreverent about Dev, but as a woman, I think it might have not been such a bad thing because women were probably the biggest victims of what happened, what was done by that new state. And that was because Dev didn't have an input into the proclamation.
Yeah, but let's not mythologise the proclamation as being a feminist document. It portrayed Ireland as Mother Ireland rather than as equals.
It proclaimed equality and it proclaimed universal suffrage.
Yeah, because there were different people.
Profoundly radical for its time.
Well, no, it wasn't profoundly radical, it was progressive. It was progressive, it wasn't profoundly radical. It was certainly on the right side of history. It was certainly on the right side of history, but it wasn't profoundly radical.
But once you're in a monarchy, though, Pat, you're kind of saying that you're not agreeing with equality because you have people you have a two-tier society. So at least the proclamation was setting out what we're going for. People's lives haven't kind of lived up to that aspiration, but at least we're saying that we are all equal and we're
and very quickly, if you look at what the proclamation says about women, this is not Catholic theocracy. It's quite the opposite. You know, what the proclamation says about equality is a threat, actually, to the Catholic dogma of the time. What the proclamation says about equality and about women is, I mean, there's a reason why the Catholic Church hierarchy and the Church were so opposed to the Rising and everything that it's proclaimed. And if we track forward, you know, one of the great tragedies, actually, of what followed the Rising was the fact that those principles were set aside entirely and that theocracy took over. And we saw that right throughout history.
But Colin, do you not think that now, 100 years later, people want to take the Catholicism out of what happened in the Rising because it doesn't sit with our contemporary distaste for, you know, the oppression that the Catholic Church caused, because it was there. Now, of course, you're right about in terms of the proclamation being an egalitarian document and so on, but I do think that it's, as somebody who defected from the Catholic Church, so I've no talk with the Catholic Church, but I do think there is, as you said, a disquiet with that kind of dogma and that kind of language in it, and the blood sacrifice stuff and even the Easter stuff, all that kind of stuff, that it is easier for people to say, no, Connolly was the man and Pearse was a big holy Joe.
How much of that is an appropriation
of
the Rising itself, by what followed and by the Catholic Church and by those who followed?
I think Colin's right. I think there was an appropriation afterwards. They used the Catholic Bulletin to turn them all into martyrs.
Oisin, for someone growing up in Northern Ireland, that legacy of the Rising, I mean, the language is pretty decimated. The church is in many places pretty decimated, but the one thing that has thrived, if you like, have been Gaelic games. And do you see the link back to what was striven for in 1916?
Yeah, because it wasn't a game. We didn't grow up playing a game. We grew up and that was part of our identity. So we carried that identity around with us whenever we moved around the north or even to come down south to play in games. That was our identity. It meant more, and we felt it meant more to us than it did to anybody else. If I was to think of a 40-year-old who lives 3 miles away from me over the border, and I look at their life growing up and my life growing up, they are absolutely poles apart. In fact, you know, I would feel that we were forgotten in many ways for a lot of years. And therefore, for us, we had one identity, and that was through the language and through the GAA.
Why would you want to be united with the rest of the island that abandoned you then?
Well, I was just going to ask the question round the table, if anybody has suffered from oppression in their life, if anybody has experienced oppression. And certainly we would have had examples of how we were oppressed. I mean, to have a British Army move in beside you, basically take over your town. The football field that you played on wasn't yours anymore. You go to training, they stop the car, they stop you in the street, throw your bag out on the road. And, you know, you're destined to, I suppose, grow up with that hatred of the British Army, first and foremost, but not the gays you were actually meeting on the street, but the system, or the people who put them there. You know, and if somebody is to come into my house tonight, you know, if it's somebody I don't want there, I will ask them to leave. If they don't leave, I'll forcefully try and make them leave, because that's what has been built up in me from I was growing up in a small village in South Armagh.
Well, I agree with that in terms of the feeling forgotten. And there's another parallel to that. My late wife was a Southern Protestant, and she, ironically enough, identified with Northern Catholics in a way that she felt that they were both the communities that were forgotten on both sides of the border.
I want to move on. We will take a susbiog, short break, and we'll come back and consider our verdict. You're all welcome back to the jury room for our final deliberations. And before we give our final thoughts on all of these matters, we want to remind ourselves of the powerful closing statements from both the prosecution and defence.
Liberty is a fine thing. It is a noble thing to wish for. But what is it for if it is not for the will of the people? The Irish people want home rule. They did not want this rebellion. And therefore, no matter how you choose to represent it, it is impossible to condone. For this reason, Patrick Pearse deserves to be found guilty. But for crimes of deceit, delusion, vanity, and arrogance, he deserves to be forgotten.
I've learned one thing this past few weeks. Men and women, we have no control over an idea. We may argue and cajole it, manipulate it, and wrestle it into submission, but it will always escape our grasp. An idea that lives on lives not in the mind of a man, but in the minds of many, and that is why it can never be conquered or tamed. I know now I cannot control it. I am but a man who has lived with conflict within me. I'm a man who must finally admit that deep in my soul I do not want to die. Yet I must accept that I may. This court decide if I get to live. But the unborn generations of the future will decide if I will become something more. An idea worth remembering.
So, an idea worth remembering, or someone who deserves to be forgotten? Damien?
Well, Pat, I have to say this, you know, for me, it's over 3 centuries, you know, of British colonialism around the world, and slavery, genocide, starvation, an estimated 150 million people dying as a direct consequence of this colonialism. Where was their trial? You know? They got away with scot-free. That's what I'd say.
But I wonder, are we being swayed now by the emotion of the past 100 years? Because if this was a crime of theft and we established very clearly that the person had stolen the item, but that we are saying, but the person was also the victim of a lot of oppression and they were justified in stealing it. By the law of the land and our duty as jurors, we would have to convict.
No, not necessarily. Throughout my career in addiction, and I've watched judges especially consider the circumstances of the person in front of them.
Okay, so extenuating circumstances for
Yeah.
that.
And the other point is, remember, he's not charged with theft, he's charged with treason. And treason is a construct of those who have charged him with that crime, who were his enemies in that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, if you disagree with the system and if you don't believe in what the empire stands for, then what is the meaning of treason?
Yeah, but then equally, he is claiming the allegiance of every Irish man and woman who don't consent to giving allegiance to that. Now, on that evidence, it's clear that he's guilty. It's clear that he himself would have found himself guilty. So what I'm wondering is why so many people here are reluctant to follow the evidence in that way. If you don't vote for him to be guilty, you're betraying his legacy because he wanted to be found guilty.
If this happened to a member, for example, of the Provisional IRA, they simply would not recognise the court. Whereas in this case, in this fictitious trial, not alone does Pearse recognise the court, he participates in the whole legal charade of what's going on.
In another trial, we saw how that played out. Casement refused. I mean, this was part of Casement's defence in his own case, was that this court had no right to try him, an Irish man, of treason against the British Crown because he didn't recognise the British Crown. Nevertheless, he was convicted and, as you know, executed ultimately.
The Casement comparison is a fascinating one because one of the very reasons why the British government made such a big deal about the Casement trial is they wanted to protect themselves from charges that they had behaved disgracefully in Ireland in having these drumhead court-martials. But I think Pearse has been judged in the courtroom of Irish history and he's been found not guilty there. And I think you see that in the public respect for him.
I think the question of Irish independence was going on for so many hundred years, it wouldn't have gone away. We'd be still talking about it now if we weren't in a situation of having a republic. So I think even if we got home rule, there still would be a movement or an underground of some kind. I think self-determination is really an important psychology to have as a citizen.
Nick, your final thoughts?
I think Patrick made the most telling comments. It was a misjudgment on behalf of the English authorities, and it was most definitely a cover-up. And with all great cover-ups, you act swiftly and you avoid having the serious questions answered. And that's only embodied even more by the fact that the documents were suppressed for so long.
Emma.
I feel quite saddened, I guess, that we didn't get to see the vision of some of these people lived out. But that's also something that we see across the globe often when there are kind of nationalist movements and there are really progressive revolutionary thinkers at the helm of them. They're usually swiftly executed by the British, and often the forces that come into the power vacuum that is created by independence are often quite repressive forces, and often that is something that's intentionally put into place. So yeah.
Oisín.
When I watch that closing sequence, it gets something going inside you. And I think the mark of a person is to have an ideal, but not just to have an ideal, but what they're willing to do. Are they willing to see that through to the end?
Justine.
I find it impossible to be objective because I am a beneficiary of what Pearse and Connolly and the others fought for 100 years ago. I have the great luxury of living in a country which is self-governed and has self-determination. We have a republic. We have the principles of a republic set down, and it is an inclusive model that we're all part of. These are the sort of intangible gifts that they have handed down to us. And the great luxury is that it is something that each of us has. We are not beholden to a foreign occupying power.
All right.
Our destiny is our own.
Okay, we are coming to decision time now, and your dilemma, as I would see it, is that if you're happy with at least the aspiration coming from Pearse's proclamation, if you find him guilty, he dies, and we get where we are today. If you find him innocent and acquit him, we don't know where we'd be. We'd have no martyrs, no blood sacrifice.
But we might have greater implementation of the proclamation.
And of course, as chairman of the jury, we still haven't heard what your views are, Pat.
We would love to know the foreman's view. That would help guide me, I think, in how we
The foreman would be instinctively going to acquit the man with certain reservations, because the foreman would have massive reservations about, for example, the killing of the man on St. Stephen's Green, the killing of the RIC man outside Dublin Castle. Lots of reservations about that. Would I see Pearse as an idealist? Yes. Would I see him as somewhat deluded? Yes. Would I see him as someone who was out of touch with ordinary Dublin people, of which I would certainly have been one? Yes. But given what we've achieved, I suppose, with the wisdom of hindsight, I'd say I'd have to acquit him because I would admire what he was doing. So, shall we vote?
Let's do it.
How we're going to do this, you each have, at the back of your notebook, you've got two cards. One says guilty and one says not guilty, and your verdict card is to be placed in the middle of the table. And the question you have to answer is, was Patrick Pearse guilty as charged? So take your time, contemplate all the ramifications of your vote, and in your own time, you may place the card in the middle of the table. Face down, because this is a secret ballot. Well, we have 12 votes, so you have made your decision. I want to thank you all very much for your service, and the jury at the trial of the century is now discharged. Thank you again.
For a century, the events of the Easter Rising have inspired arguments and divided the Irish people. Tonight, our jury of 12 have made their decision. But the arguments about the 1916 Rising are sure to continue for years to come.